So please welcome Kuba Szreder, who is a writer, activist, and curator based in Warsaw. And we'll be talking about how to practice art beyond art in our times of fascism. So following on from the theory topics that we've been discussing in the last few lectures as well. And he promised me that this will be even bleaker than the one that I gave. So
Really? No. But we can have this competition, it's always a kind of grim competition,
Yeah.
Who had its wars. But actually I will try to finish on an upbeat note, which is possibly not easy in the age of rising fascism. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much for coming. I know that some friendly faces who are here came actually from a pretty far away. So thanks so much for being here. And yeah, let me start. And let me start by saying or positioning myself. So actually, for the last year, I've been doing with a group of people. Some of you will see on the images who I will present, something called Anti-fascist Year, which is a joint coalition of institutions, collectives, and individuals with approximately 150 participating agents and hundreds of events, that is officially organized between September 2019 and May 2020 in Poland. This logo is a logo of the Anti-fascist Year. It has this play, or like a visual play between kind of institutions, Polish parliament, and flags. And the idea of Anti-fascist Year was to mobilize in response to what we found as recurrent or returning fascism. As I've already said, the Anti-fascist Year as such is a very loose coalition, in fact, of very different people and agents. So there were like both large institutions like a Museum of Modern Art in Warsaw, but also very small collectives in different parts of Poland, because this was organized and still is organized in Poland. There were both theaters and theater people and visual arts and galleries and festivals and exhibitions, and a lot of different things were being organized. What I wanted to share with you is the resource that we produced. This is called Atlas, and the webpage of the Anti-fascist Year features the Atlas of Anti-fascist Art, its legacy and current iterations, which is usually marginalized by art history and discourse. So if you enter this very long webpage, antifaszystowski.org, there you will find an English version of this resource, and there is about 40 entries documenting things that were happening in the scope of last century, more or less. So we are starting with 1919, or like around First World War, and finishing with activities which are happening more or less now. And the Anti-fascist Year is initiated by the Consortium for Postartistic Practices, whose sigil animal is a dark rabbit, and more on this later. CPP is a consortium of reconstructionists, militant conceptualists, post-artists, and not artists. The idea to organize the Anti-fascist Year was floated at a carnival bar of the CPP in February 2019. The bar, it was a kind of mask ball, and the title of this was Ni to pies ni wydra, which translates as neither otter nor a dog, but idiomatically is translated as neither fowl nor fish, as CPP's activities are frequented by different hybrid species, tuned with the spirit of Berlin Dada. This is actually my philosopher friend of ours, also helped us to define, to write a definition of fascism, but during this ball people dressed as actually different types of animals, and while we discussed also what can be done in response to this grim political situation in which we find ourselves in Poland. But Consortium for Post-Artistic Practices is named after the concept of Polish theoretician of conceptual art, Jerzy Ludwiński, who in his text from 1971 discussed the consequences of the conceptual revolution in art and the dissolution of modernist institution of art. And he wrote in the following words: "Perhaps even today, we do not deal with art. We might have overlooked the moment when it transformed itself into something else, something which we cannot yet name. It is certain, however, that what we deal with offers greater possibilities. This was 1971. And he wrote these words in the context of art worlds of actually existing socialism, with their own artistic institutions, seminars, gatherings, definitely not enough money, but plenty of free time. I kind of want to emphasize it here to also highlight a kind of specific historical and socioeconomic context in which these words were written, because I think it has quite important implications also to our current discussions. Especially if you compare words of Ludwinski and the atmosphere of art theory that these conditions elicited with the words of Lucy Lippard from her famous text, The Dematerialization of the Art Object, 1966 and to 1972. It is pretty, this particular quote is pretty famous in this way, that she describes what she already noticed, which was like the commercialization of the conceptual art. And she writes in 1973 in the following manner. Hopes that conceptual art would be able to avoid the general commercialization, the destructively progressive approach of modernism were, for the most part, unfounded. It seemed in 1969 that no one, not even a public greedy for novelty, would actually pay money or much of it for a Xerox sheet referring to an event past or never directly perceived, and so on, right? So she basically described the commercialization of like the art world as we almost, as you know it, or the art world as we kind of know it all over, because these processes that she kind of identified in 1973, taking a look at the New York art world, well, later on became the norm everywhere. And I think still is to the vast extent in different parts of the global art world. And yet this kind of like description, much more like upbeat and much different in its the spirit and also in the words used by Ludwinski, is not only, I think, a kind of misguided misreading of what is happening around him, but actually it refers directly to the conditions that he encountered that surrounded him. People were basically, like it was a actually existing socialism. People really didn't have money, but they kind of, but the socialist state did support like a network of art institutions. So every major town in Poland had an institution devoted to at least modern art. Some of them actually were used by this new wave of conceptual or post-avant-gardist, as it was called, artists to organize different gatherings, seminars. And Ludwinski himself was a kind of like almost like a traveling kind of a dharma type of drifter. So he basically drifted from one place to another, from one gathering to another, where he discussed these changes in conceptual art. I mean, there would be another lecture would be needed to describe in detail what he actually meant. What is important for me is that this is our kind of intellectual patron, in a sense. But to discuss the blurred ontologies of post-art, we refer to a famous illusion of dark rabbit, which was actually, it was first kind of like emerged in 19th century, later on it was used by Wittgenstein, but usually it is used to discuss this kind of like, shifts of perception, but this is very, and how perception depends on our own cognitive frameworks. So if you know that this is a duck rabbit, you start to see that, you can see that like sometimes it's a duck, sometimes it's a rabbit, but you understand the image differently if you would not have known it. But it's also interesting for us, at least, in the Consortium for Postartistic Practices, that duck rabbits are this kind of shifty animals, that sometimes it's a duck, sometimes it's a rabbit, sometimes it's very hard to say, with what I'm going to show you, whether it is art, post-art, not art, or maybe something kind of in between, or both. And Yes, you see, duck rabbits are actually pretty popular. To my surprise, I discovered that like duck rabbits are now even featured on the webpage of Institute for Contemporary Art in London. I don't know how did they find themselves there, but they somehow are there. Just near the kind of information about like you can donate here or there. But this is a blog spot of Julie Trump, and she discusses with gorące rzezimieszki, which is hot, I don't know what. Nevertheless, they just describe. They just have a discussion about what the fuck is that, and she responds, "It's a wet dream of Wittgenstein." So, like, obviously, this the duck rabbits populate also like this vast and dark extents of a web. But for us, they more refer to actually our daily practices, and also to pretty serious kind of art activist activities that we, with Consortium for Postartistic Practices, somehow animate since a couple of years. I mean, yeah, I should have said it. It was more or less established like 4 years ago. And CPP activated politically in response to the recurrence of ur-fascism, reenacting historical experiences of resistance. Moving images from the exhibitions to the streets. It sounds very cryptic, so let me explain it. Basically, what you see on top is a image from 1936 depicting a group of men in suits, which back then were typical kind of social composition of artists, writers, and poets who came to the streets of Warsaw in protest against rising fascism. They carry this sign which reads, "Literature and Art Against Fascism." In March of 2018, this image was exhibited in a main Polish National Art Gallery called Zachęta at the exhibition that was kind of discussing, or like that was featuring art from the interwar period. So basically this image on top was exhibited there to also describe and depict the political activism of a group of artists and intellectuals that in this tumultuous period somehow unfolded. We took this image as an instruction for action, repainting the banner and taking it to the streets on one of the anti-racist and anti-fascist demonstrations in March of the same year, which is March of 2018. Somehow visually connecting this 1920s with what is happening currently, more in the spirit of the kind of dialectic image that both tells us something about our presence while also depicting our forgotten pasts. And the same kind of technique, so to say, was used a year later when we organized a demonstration of paintings. What you see here is a painting called the Demonstration of Paintings, painted in 1933 by a modernist Polish-Jewish painter called Henryk Streng. This was his vision of how artists could partake in the politics of Popular Front against fascism. He painted this, or he formulated this vision in the context of the artistic policies of the Popular Front against Fascism and the Congress of Cultural Workers, organized by communist writers and artists, or self-defined cultural producers, in 1936 in Lviv. More or less in the same historical moment when Walter Benjamin wrote his famous essay Autor as Producer, it was 1934, actually he delivered it in Paris, in the Institute of Studies about Fascism, and the Artistic Union self-organized in the context of Work Progress Association in USA. In March 2019, we realized the vision of Streng So instead of having a painting depicting the demonstration of paintings, we actually carried some paintings to the streets. So CPP actualized Streng's idea, treating his painting as if it was a conceptual instruction to organize an actual demonstration of paintings. And we organized a post-artistic blog at the Anti-Fascist demonstration in March 2019, which was considered as an art in the one-to-one scale, about which Stephen Wright wrote that this is both a conceptual proposition and a realization of its own, that realizes its own potential in social praxis. So that this is both art and social action. It is both something that is a vision, but it's also something that actually exists. Art on one-to-one scale is both art and more than just art proper. Shifts between art worlds and life worlds. It has both meaning and function, making use of artistic competences and institutions in social and political praxis. So one of the kind of like discussed, very often discussed examples is a parliament for Java that was designed and partially and built by the studio of Jonas Stahl, and it was commissioned by the Democratic Federation of North Syria and serves as a parliament for local assemblies. Interestingly, he also like presented this as a model of something, so he was presenting this as an artwork that was also collected by different artistic institutions while gathering funds that enabled them to build it in the kind of like one-to-one scale, on the real scale in northern Syria, where it is used as a kind of functional artwork. In his recent book on propaganda art, he uses this example as an example of how propaganda art for 21st century could look like. Because he is actually interested in stateless democracy, he's interested in radical democracy, he's interested in art that somehow affiliates with this ground-up movements, but also with such initiatives as DM25, with which he is directly working as well. So in spite of their apparent frivolity, Duck Rabbits point to the perennial theoretical and practical dilemmas, transgressing distinctions between applied and autonomous art, between art and artifact, between meaning and function, between autonomy and instrumentalization, crucial for situating contemporary art. So just on that passage, possibly we could have a long discussion and how actually this can be imagined, or whether they actually do it or not. And there was like a very interesting essay written about this issue in mid-90s by Alfred Gell, which is, I think, very well known here in Britain, already considered to be, kind of old news. And yet used, actually, interestingly, it is used very often by ethnographers when they try to imagine the function of art in different research processes, or also processes of generating knowledge by the communities with which they work. But there is another project I wanted, and another like another bit of theory, or like bit of practical imagination that I wanted to share with you, which is a seminal project of art on the one-to-one scale, is Rasheed Araeen's The Dam in Baluchistan, which is unbuilt, which is, I think, pretty important to emphasize, and yet it was imagined as a conceptual land art proposition and a functional collective intervention, and he presented it in his text, Return to Baluchistan, from 2001. So this text, Araeen starts this text very interestingly. He starts with an aesthetical question. The question is, what would be the form of land art most suitable to the deserted landscapes of his home region of Baluchistan? Then he moves on with the actually critique of people like Richard Long, or critique of the land art as he knew it at this time, or like as he knew it also in the 70s and 80s, or like as he actually criticized so many times, also at the pages of Black Phoenix, of her text, or other post-colonial journals. So this was land art that considered all these lands as uninhabited. So as if there were no people who lived there. So like land art that considered all these lands as if they were just up for grabs, as if they were there to be claimed by the white man's eye. So he says that this type of land art is unacceptable, and it cannot be done in the context of both post-colonial struggles and what he considered as a progressive artistic practice. So to this aesthetical question, he gives a political answer. The only appropriate form of land art that can be suited in this desert and in this very arid region would be a dam and a collective farm. That would be both a kind of artistic proposition and an actually existing piece of social, actualized social imagination, in fact. What he also underlined, which is, I think, very interesting in this essay, is a kind of analogy between the bourgeois structures of capitalist ownership and the conventions of authorship that analogically underpin what he called narcissistic egos, or nar-egos in short. So like he connected actually, which is also quite often not such a unique trope that happened very often, like criticizing a kind of artistic or like authorship in general with the criticism of ownership of land and means of production as something that individualizes what should be collective or what should be shared somehow. And here he also, in this proposition, he underlines the importance of actually collectivizing land, so that there is, it's not a gestural, it's not tokenistic, that this kind of intervention should entail somehow both collaboration between artists that would dismantle conventions of artistic authorship, and yet somehow maintaining artists as vital part of the vital agent in the whole process, while also enabling people to actually live on a collective land. It is unbuilt, and yet it is an interesting proposition. It's also an interesting proposition because in order to get there, he is criticizing, or like he proposes or discusses a kind of dialectics of social sculpture. Especially he criticizes Joseph Beuys, but criticizes in a very interesting way, because he is not just like dumping Beuys' idea as some sort of like evil, as kind of like narcissistic, ego-driven activity, but rather he thinks that the proposition of Beuys is a very interesting, like progressive artistic idea, and yet fails to realize its own creative potentials that somehow Beuys suggests by proposing such activity. Because as Araeen argues, Beuys managed to plant only 7,000 oaks, while he could have partaken in a political movement that would have planted millions of these trees. So he sees actually, like in this essay, he presents like he proposes that the full realization of conceptual potential that Beuys somehow tried to elicit in his activity was realized in distributed creative resistance, as he talks about this figure of Wangari Maathai, who was Nobel Prize winner in 2004, was a Green Belt movement that started in Kenya in late 70s, and result of which millions and millions of trees were planted. Obviously, there is comes a question how this kind of artistic proposition is related to a person who worked in a different part of the world without any knowledge whatsoever about Joseph Beuys, and it's a good question. And Araeen responds to it partially. I think he responds to it by completely decentering himself in this book that the essay is part of. So instead of himself, it's a kind of autobiographical book from the late 2000s called Art Beyond Art. Instead of saying, it happened to me, I was here, I was born, and so on, he starts to describe his own individual path as a partial actualization of different creative ideas that floated around him. As a kind of ideas, he also always describes himself as a as a person who is distributed amongst others, works with others, right? And that's how he sees his own personal artistic development, as a always partial actualization of ideas that are never only of his own doing. So, he's always kind of secondary to this, the flows of, how he describes, flows of creative resistance that artists can also participate in. That's where the energies come from, and yet they often do not really credit this flows that are part of, the sources of energy that they kind of embody in their artworks. So just to give you give voice to Araeen, he writes in actually it's a manifesto of eco-aesthetics. He writes in the following words: "The ideas can be and are turned into institutionally manageable objects, thus contained in the temporalities. But ideas as knowledge can never be trapped as a property of an individual or the institution. They can always salvage themselves, give themselves a new context, and move forward within the dynamic of new time and space. They can indeed perform a radically new transformative function in dealing with today's situation. But for this, art must go beyond what prevails as art and integrate itself with the collective struggle of life today to recover its true social function and become a radical force of the 21st century. It is in fact artistic imagination, not art object, which once freed from the self-destructive narcissist ego can enter this life and offer it not only salvation, but put it on path to a better future." Obviously, this sounds like a bit kind of naive, and it sounds like a bit kind of like revolutionary calls in 2010, seriously, But, like when Araeen wrote it, it was already, I think he was already in his late 70s, It's an interesting thing, I think, but this is like a kind of conclusion of his artistic biography, and yet it sounds as if it was written by a naive young person. So this was so there is, I think, some sort of we can salvage bits and pieces from this call, and especially in these times of the centering or thinking about the shifts between artistic objects and artistic imagination or competences that can be redeveloped, re-employed, recirculated, and reintegrated into a social praxis. Just to give you an example how that might function, or how that actually it functions, because it's not something that I made up. It's not only about unbuilt dams somewhere in other part of the world. There are many projects worldwide with the similarly blurred ontologies. An example at hand is this icon of the feminist black protest in Poland, and the story how it emerged, shifting also from exhibition halls to the streets, confirming the power of ideas. Because, as Araeen writes, the ideas cannot become properties of an individual despite recurring efforts at their enclosure. What you see here is a silhouette of a woman or the sign of solidarity. For those who might not know it, Solidarity was a large trade union, one of the largest at this time, in 1980s, rocking the communist government in demand of the workers' democracy. And this is a logo. I will just show you how it actually emerged. This is a part of the work by Sania Ivekovic. You can see here is also a silhouette, black silhouette of a woman on this in Poland, it's a very iconic logo. The Solidarity logo really tells you a lot. It's part of the struggle, it's part of our history. The legacy of Solidarity is still contested. So there is a whole discussion also about the presence of, or eradication of presence of women in this movement. So for example, Ewa Majewska writes a book about Solidarity. It will be published soon by Warsaw, and also about black protests as a eruption of social energy, but also as an example of what she calls weak resistance. But nevertheless, what Ivekovic tried to do, she tried to tell a story about this invisible woman of solidarity, actually riffing on detouring this particular poster. This poster, it is a poster, electoral poster that was widely popular in the first democratic elections in Poland in 1989. You have this Clint Eastwood who goes to the electoral booth voting out communists. So she does this kind of twist. This was actually an artistic installation that is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. I think the piece was created in late 2000s, and then it was taken to the streets by the woman who protested. I think it was 4 years ago against the not liberation, against attempts to make abortion law in Poland even more strict. So basically to the total ban of abortion that would make women to give birth even if it was potentially harmful to them. So the conservative government, only when it took power, wanted to introduce these draconic anti-abortion laws. And then it was like a mass, it provoked a mass mobilization of women, as it was in a rainy period. The symbol of this protest was a black umbrella. That's why also it was called Black Protest. So the protesters took this Ivekovic's symbol, they put it back on streets, also claiming that they are the real democratic force that is continuing the legacy of solidarity. Obviously then the symbol goes through a lot of different iterations, or like the icon, it becomes repurposed, reused, changed, etc., etc. Interestingly, it actually, why I wrote here about this recurring efforts at their enclosure. The Solidarity Union, which is currently a yellow trade union supporting government and very conservative and very nationalistic, they wanted to prohibit the use of this image. So they actually started to even harass the organizers of these demonstrations with legal actions, talking about the copyright or quoting the copyrights to this particular logo type. Interestingly, the designer of this original logo supported the women's feminist protest, and also the museum was somehow involved in the whole debate because Sania Ivekovic was quoted as one of the original as one of the people who started this whole thing by hacking and detouring the image in the first instance. Obviously, museum did not have anything against this being used in the context of feminist protests. Another thing that can be that I wanted to quote here, or that I wanted to highlight, is that Araeen, Wright, Ludwinski give us tool to navigate on the expanded field of art, where boundaries between art and not art are very blurred. But what you see here is a self-portrait of Katrin Böhm, who is here today with us, a founder of Company Drinks. And this image, or this series of soda waters, is called Sour Brexit. The last of this, it was produced in 2016. The soda waters were so sour that people made this kind of funny faces. The story of this drinks is that I think the last load of bottles from that still left from 2016 were donated to Whitehall, or at least on this Friday. You can imagine why. But the interesting thing is that this type of activities, which are both kind of fizzy drinks, which are both critical interventions, which are both kind of have a mixed stages of art that can be collected. These bottles were collected by V&A. They can be drunk, they can be sold, because that's what Company Drink is doing in Barking and Dagenham. they have precisely this duck-rabbity kind of hybrid status. They are artistically charged because of their usefulness, and more useful because they are imaginative and playful, right? They actually taste different, and people approach them differently because they are artistically charged. You have like, you know, the taste kind of like, or undertaste of this kind of soda water is slightly different when you know what it is about. And you know what it is about because every bottle has a story about its own, well, basically it's a story of its own production, but also the story of its own self-description of the senses that it carries. So it is both a kind of like a fizzy drink that can be drunk and a exhibitable object that can be somehow exhibited, but then it is much more nicer to actually drink it, but it can be also collected like it is by BA. In order to cater to this flows of artistic imagination, the institutional models need to be transformed, as multitudes worldwide search for new formulas of the Museum 3.0, constituent and useful artistic institutions of the common. Obviously, it is also a bit maybe overtly optimistic, and yet I think that there is an emergent kind of need, at least amongst like different European public institutions, to find new models of functioning and to not only commission artistic pans that questions the use value of art. This is a piece by Tania Bruguera that she put a Duchampian urinal bag to the bathroom in Vanabe Museum in 2013, but also hosts such ambitious undertakings as the Museum of Art Utile. The exhibition, which was the exhibition by Tania Bruguera in Vanabe Museum in Eindhoven, but I think this is less interesting. The more interesting part is that this is also a digital database and related association that contributes to a wider trend of institutional experimentation, establishing offices and schools of useful art worldwide. And I would like, you know, because I know, well, we all possibly are aware of not necessarily the most successful Bruguera's installation in Turbine Hall, but I think it's much more interesting to take a look at this association of art utile and how it is activated in different by different institutions worldwide. Obviously, this is a kind of like image from this Friday, this kind of thing, riffing of this kind of like institutional experiments with useful art, riff on legacy of really useful knowledge, craftsy arts and artsy crafts. This is the Whitworth in Manchester, and I think that this will be very interesting to also follow the developments of the Whitworth Gallery and the under directorship of Alistair Hudson. And these institutions not only organize exhibitions of anti-fascist art, such as Never Again, which was organized in Museum of Modern Art and was a highlight of the Anti-Fascist Year, but also embedding these exhibitions in wider political struggles against fascism, like the Anti-Fascist Year, which in itself works in a coalition with different types of initiatives. This exhibition was actually pretty, very comprehensive, got extremely good reviews, and this was depicting the histories of art and anti-fascist involvement of different artists, from the story of Guernica here, and the Guernica in itself is an amazing kind of, it would be an amazing painting to depict how, or like to discuss how the image moves from being a commissioned propaganda poster in like large scale, because that was an original intention of this, to kind of like Picasso's expression of his own angst and protest against war, to like one of the most well-known protests, or like most widely reproduced protest poster in worldwide. But still, I think that the main challenge of this kind of institutions is to how to stay on the trouble, and how to stay faithful to the alliances established in spite of passing fashions, political pressures, and financial constraints. because that's what usually happens. You have like one exhibition, then you have to make another one. You have one project, then you move to another. You have like one project after another, hundreds of projects in the same time. You would expect institutions to be more stable. In fact, they are even worse, because they have to cater to this, to what they understand as a very flickery public attention, or like streams of try to capture this flows of public attention to maintain their own position. We can also, if it's interesting, we can also talk about that. But then, like, institutions can also work as support structures to sustain off-site projects like the Open Anti-Fascist Studio, a refurbished kiosk K67 that provides, that was actually built by Yugoslavian designer, now I forgot the name, in the 60s. Usually it is used to actually sell tickets of zapiekankas or other kind of like burgers. But this time it was refurbished as an open anti-fascist studio that was originally it was just made last year. First it stayed in Lublin, near Galeria Labyrinth, one of the public institutions that operates there. And it will move to different kind of both art, not art, or semi-art institutions in the entire Poland in this season and hopefully in the seasons after. Artistic institutions, collectives and consortia partake in culture wars against fascism. Because artists, post-artists and not artists are well equipped with weird tools to recalibrate debate, work with symbols and attract public attention. What you see here is one of the most recent activities by the Consortium for Post-Artistic Practices, which was a parade with 20 flags that redesigned the symbol of three arrows, which was in itself, the symbol of three arrows, it's a typical or like traditional anti-fascist symbol. That was commissioned in 1931 by the German organization, I think, Iron Front, that was associated with the German Social Democratic Party. So three arrows are like a symbol of anti-fascist movement. When we started to talk with the anti-fascist coalition that organizes an annual march, annual demonstration against fascism that happens on 11th of November. 11th of November is a Polish National Day that was recently captured by alt-righters to organize the largest right-wing demonstration in Europe. Usually they have between 100,000 and 300,000 people. So then the anti-fascist coalition does not want to give the entire space to this, does not want to simply resign from a collective right to the space and collective right to express difference and organize and also express anti-fascist sentiment. So organizes this annual street party in which a couple of thousand people participate. Most of people simply want to leave Warsaw. And this year, when they gave us a kind of like very general brief, so to say, but very general, but the aim is to disenchant or like de-stereotype this symbol of three arrows, which is usually considered also by liberal intellectuals and liberal media, but also part of the left media, as contaminated by, it's kind of related in public opinion with the black bloc, guys running around in balaclavas, smashing windows and stuff like this, a typical kind of unjustified and ungrounded stereotype of anarchist activists. While in fact the third arrows can be used to actually express a range of very positive emotions and also a range of very positive to affiliate this, like to still re-affiliate it with the struggle against fascism by showing how, by creating these positive affiliations with the symbol. So we asked like this group of designers who are affiliated with the consortium to rework and redesign the symbol, and then printed it on large flags, and organized this quiet, large post-artistic bloc as part of this large anti-fascist street party. And the important thing to underline is that post-artistic projects never exist in a social vacuum. They make sense only as part of the wider alliance, such as anti-fascist coalition that organize this annual anti-fascist street party that I talked about. The post-artistic bloc, this is what you see, it's called basically the plan of street party. The post-artistic bloc is just one of many, standing in solidarity with the multitude of anti-fascist, ecological, pro-democratic, LGBT plus and feminist comrades, employing artistic imagination in the struggles against fascism. And I think that instead of being fixated on the crudely understood political efficiency, I think it's necessary, obviously, but potentially misleading and disheartening, considering the scale of the challenge posed by the resurgent fascism. Possibly it would be more productive to think about post-artistic blocks as partaking the politics of embodied and activated hope. And that's why I want to conclude with not with my own words, but with a quote from the Rebecca Solnit's Hope in the Dark, where she writes, "Hope is not a lottery ticket that can sit on the sofa and clutch, feeling lucky. Hope is an axe you break down doors with in an emergency. Because hope should shove you out of the door, because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures, and the grinding down of poor and marginal. Hope just means another world might be possible, not promised, not guaranteed. Hope calls for action. Action is impossible without hope." Thank you.
Through your talk, it was hopefully clear what you meant by the post-artistic or post-artist, and also probably most people would feel somewhat comfortable with the term artist, but you didn't define, and maybe it would be useful for those who are not aware of how it's used, the term not artist.
Was it Kaprow, right? Yeah, I mean, like even Ludwinski in his, actually he misquoted one of his conceptualists from the 70s who said that art is everything but what looks as art. And then I think it's a bit kind of tongue-in-cheek thing of describing stuff that has some sort of like artistic potentials, but is not necessarily art proper. So something which is, because we could easily say that this is art, this is not art, but something which is not art would be something else than just art. Possibly it's like even worse, like I made it even more unclear. But I guess that the lack of clarity is more of a, it's a bit of a pun, but one of these meaningful puns that let you think about what would be the negation of negation, right? What would be, like if we think about, for example, labor and capital, right? This is very often used, but you have this idea that capital is kind of like negation of labor, and yet like the not alienated labor will be just more than simply negating capital, because it will be a kind of released human energy. Yeah?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm sure there are lots of questions from...
I heard a lot about the role of the artist, but not necessarily about the cultural space in which these interventions are taking place, or constructing the cultural space in which you could have like a broader anti-fascist culture. So I only hear about it in this with respect to the kind of work that the designers have been kind of brought in to do. But I guess for me, I think in terms of like anti-fascist organizing, one of the biggest struggles has always been to create a kind of, whether the goal is to create a kind of popular culture, which it seems like it needs to be, like how to actually create that in a way where people who are non-practitioners who don't recognize their own production in some way still feel energized by it, because as artists we might all feel quite energized by the popular potential that this kind of demonstrates for a role that we might have, but it doesn't really, for me, say how this can instigate something for those outside of it, and I think that is a question that art has to answer insofar as art isn't just for artists, or at least should be trying to speak to a general public of some kind.
I mean, I understand this was a comment.
Well, it was a question for like how you see maybe potentially this, like some, sorry, how some like whether this is just something that is included in some of, you were talking about the Anti-Fascist Year, for example. Is there a kind of perspective that this has on the question of like how this can relate to an audience rather than just to artists as practitioners, and to create a kind of cultural space?
Well, obviously there is a discussion, and I made this presentation with obviously other practitioners in mind. So I wouldn't present it in this way if I was talking with other audiences. But then, like when we did this flags, I think they do not really use a kind of very. It's not a particularly elusive kind of visual language. They use kind of like language that is pretty popularized, especially I think amongst the younger people. It's also usually very hard to expect that the message will get to everyone. But this kind of message that these three arrows kind of want to convey, I think can be quickly described in a couple of sentences. The aim of this was actually, or usually the aim of this type of interventions is to create some sort of like media-friendly images, so that they can be broadcasted and they can provide some sort of, like better visual kind of component of understandable visual component for for the message to be somehow distributed. And obviously I showed our intervention, but this demonstration was much wider. There were like people who used a lot of different modes of communication. This was one of the blogs that looked pretty spectacular. People also have a convention of these flags on streets, and kind of like, some sort of collective choreography is pretty well known everywhere. And I guess that here also context is a message in a sense. That if you exhibit this kind of flags in a space devoted to art, you just basically have also a different type of perception of it than if you put it in the context of a demonstration. But I also think that this type of flags can move between one and another, between these different transactional domains without losing the potential. Obviously, like they will be understood differently by different people, but still, I hope at least that they are kind of communicatable. And paradoxically, like I'm sure that there was a whole discussion. Obviously, there is always discussion in the kind of anti-fascist circles, whether this kind of, what we know from history, this three arrows, whether this is not more kind of to the point, or that this is already how it should be, and so on. So not necessarily everybody appreciates this kind of intervention, which is also, I think, fair enough. But what is paradoxical in this is that this traditional symbol is somehow considered by the majority of people who are like journalists or other intellectuals as uninteresting, or something that should not be discussed, or like people have also a very stereotypical understanding of these three arrows as something which is negatively connotated with some sort of like very elusive and hermetic circles of anarchist activists. have I responded to your question? Sort of.
So I'm quite interested in the social design aspect. So in a way, what you're describing is a way in which art doesn't quite forsake its autonomy, but enters into convergence with leftist social design. But I'm interested in the moment of, I guess, what happens to institutions of art. You quickly touched on an interest in the museum 3.0 in your talk. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what that meant. Partly just to understand what it is, but also in relationship to Simon's talk, where he was describing situations which you'd be familiar with in Poland, Hungary, elsewhere, where Museum 2.0, something like Tate Modern, I guess, the kind of contemporary art museum complex, are kind of under attack by far-right fascist regimes. So the issue is whether the attempt would be to protect the contemporary art museum complex 2.0 against the fascist creep, or whether to kind of convert the museum into something else. So that's one question. Just what happens to Museum 2.0 given that? Do you want the second question now? Or do you want
Yeah, maybe it's yeah. I mean, I'm afraid that while reviewing this presentation today in the morning, I was actually thinking about our email exchange when we discussed that it doesn't have to be overtly academic, but it can be also a bit chatty in this respect, but I can flow the different concepts without expanding on them. Hoping that there will be questions related to it. So yeah, thank you for the question. Now I can start with another lecture on that. And maybe the simple answer would be that, at least it is my belief, that the museums, the only way for them to, I'm talking about progressive museums, or even kind of consider this type of question, because a lot of it just want to adapt and want to follow with the market forces, or want to cater to new authoritarian regimes, and there are many of such institutions, I think the majority in fact. But the ones who actually want to protect themselves need to reinvent themselves in the spirit of the Museum 3.0, or need to think about more carefully about the groups of people with whom they align, like the kind of so to say, instead of thinking about audiences that has to just tick different boxes of audience development, will serve as co-producers of the programs, or be considered as agents and not necessarily as just receivers, right? So this would be one thing. In our case, I think that the Museum of Modern Art, if not for this fascist creep, would have never ever, would just simply and happily go with the development of the Museum 2.0. But they were definitely on this type of track, right? To become a kind of regional powerhouse in a kind of also collecting and kind of making exhibitions, attracting audiences, becoming more and more kind of relevant in global scene while still fashionable local. That's a kind of recipe, right? But because of this political turmoil, they had to find different ways how they can actually recalibrate their own programs. So I can give you a couple of examples of the exhibitions that were organized in this respect, but then the question is also how to move from an exhibition making to a more strategic perspective. And I think that this is a huge problem for all of these institutions, because just as individual artists, individual curators, freelancers, we are so very much enthralled by this necessity to propose new stuff, all the time new stuff, all the time something new. You are as good as your last project, and the last project is forgotten about in the scope of a couple of months or something. Paradoxically, the institutions are kind of turbo exposed to this kind of thing, So they have to. So there are a lot of forces at play that actually prevent them from sticking with the issue, or sticking to the issue, or staying with the trouble. Sometimes it's easier to establish some sort of alliance than just to keep this friendship.
Okay, so can I just ask you kind of related but distinct question. It's mainly from your own experience in Warsaw, maybe speaking to what's happening in Hungary, if you know about it as well. What are the early signs of fascist creep into the art institutions? Asking for a friend.
Once again, the last part.
What are the early signs? I mean, because as I understand it, in Warsaw there's been not quite attack, but takeover of cultural institutions by far-right governments, and it's one of the test beds for the governments to see how far they can go into civil society, how far they can take over institutions and so on. Certainly what happened in Hungary.
Yeah.
You've had the experience of that.
Yeah, very direct.
So
yeah.
I was just wondering if you could tell us what the early signs of that are, so it can be recognized as it happens.
It's recorded, right? So this is okay. Let me. I mean, like the situation is very. Maybe I will actually highlight a paradox that we faced recently. So a lot of, so for example, academic, maybe just to also highlight what are the kind of like weird rhetorical conundrums with which we have to somehow, to which we are exposed. So currently, our government plans to establish what is called a Committee for Freedom of Speech that would encroach on academic autonomy, so that, for example, climate denialists can have their lectures there. So that the aim of this Committee for the Freedom of Speech is to actually prevent any type of protest against messages which are otherwise still considered as a hate speech by the law. Like that there is this, or maybe another. Maybe I will give you a couple of snippets. You know, maybe this is a kind of like, because maybe this will be more telling. A couple of these images. Another interesting image is a program that was proposed to for the CCA Ujazdowski Castle, but it's a new director, where he not only talks a lot about cultural Marxism, this is one of the code words that you need to look for, and also it's a very interesting thing, they use kind of like leftist critique of the art market in order to install their own people in institutions. So for example, they kind of deny, or they would consider the contemporary art market as some sort of kind of conspiration of cultural Marxists, or like basically the art market is a conveyor of leftist messages. I don't know how did they end up there, but this is, you know, one of the popular tropes of what is happening. And in order to somehow rescue art from this type of conjuncture between art market and leftism, kind of international intellectual allies or something like this, you need to install your own people, and then somehow it's not very, actually it's a contradiction in terms, but then turn these places into either temples of high art, but also the places like this gallery that here kind of wanted to platform alt-right messages as something that is accepted in public sphere. So, you know, it's a very weird mix of this kind of conservative notion of the good, the true and beautiful, and then you have posters which presented by these fellows which with the message woman better. Right? But this is all, it's a kind of like direct homophobic or direct misogynist, all in the name of the freedom of speech, for example. So also in Poland, maybe like, you know, this is also like part of the whether it is bleak or not, you know, like it did not go as far as it went in Hungary yet. Who knows what will happen in the future? But basically the signs are pretty obvious, they just start to change directors. There is a whole case in Poland. They are completely allergic to any kind of sign of what they consider as disloyalty, which is also a typical trait of fascism. So the kind of criticism is not accepted as such. You have to be compliant. You might be personally unhappy whatsoever, but publicly you always have to comply. And you have to support what is presented as an effort of national renewal. I'm sure that there are some connections with what is happening here. So there is this notion of internal enemies or enemies of the people that is being used in order to, for example, either dismantle different institutions that they perceive as potentially disloyal or disruptive, or to install their own people. So I think that in a strategic sense, they want to step by step take over, build their own cadres. So there is this understanding, also very nepotistic understanding of if you are with us, you basically have a leeway to do whatever. It's a training ground. So typical types of criticism that would be activated in this kind of situation. So, for example, saying that somebody is not competent or something like this is also the notion of competence. I'm sorry, it's obviously very drifty, but the topic is so large that my talk is very drifty. But then I hope it is somehow understandable. But then the notion of competence is very interesting there as well, because you would think that this is that a kind of highlighting incompetence of some people would be considered as an argument against them. But in this type of a tower defense, as we call it, tower defense, or very defensive mentality, any type of criticism from the outside is actually considered as a type of compliment. If people who you think are cultural Marxists start to tell you that you are incompetent, it's just a signal for your backers that something that you are right person in the right spot. So that would be. So I think there are this kind of situations that are. Yes, there are a lot of multiple kind of it works on a multiple different layers, and. It's not like that. They have a program and say now we will dismantle artistic institutions. No, it's much more convoluted. It's also much more. It's all very often it's not spoken directly about. Sometimes it's kind of chipping out here, chipping out there. Sometimes it's putting your own people. Sometimes it's just disturbing or disrupting. So making life harder for people to get grants or something, this is a kind of stuff. Or another example of how they want to, or maybe how they actually, very wisely in a sense, hijack even very appropriate political tendencies, is a plan to implement a kind of artistic retirement system and health system, ensure artists access to health system and retirement. Not to get into details, in Poland basically it's a lot of artists do not have it. What they want to do, they want to build some sort of guilds. And the guilds will be operated, so you will be certified as an artist in order to get access to this type of public services. Something that we actually, as a kind of trade unions, artistic trade unions, that we advocated for many, many years, and yet the price of this will be loyalty to the government, right? So that you will have they say that this is not the intention, obviously, but then still what you see is a kind of notion of the guild, which is kind of a certification that opens up the whole range of possible of corruption and also of punishing people for perceived lack of loyalty.
Hi. Just a two-part question. So before when you were talking kind of about this specific work, you conceded that the visual language of it is dumbed down. I wonder how you could then hold the position that the instrumentalization of the work didn't cannibalize the work itself. So rather than oscillating between an autonomy and instrumentalization, it does one. And the second question is, do you or what do you see as novel in the strategy?
Excuse me, what?
As novel in this strategy?
Could you please repeat the first part of the question?
Sure. So, for example, in this work behind you, you conceded that the visual
This one?
language, yeah,
Okay.
you conceded that the visual language is dumbed down for accessibility. How could you hold the position that the instrumentalization of the work didn't cannibalize the work itself and its autonomy? How could you then hold that there's an oscillation between the autonomy and the instrumental? And then the second question was, what do you see as novel in your strategy?
Maybe I will start with the second thing. I'm not sure whether it's particularly novel, to be frank. You know, I think that lots of these things, like, you know, when I was like, maybe I'll just, can I stand up? And then, I mean, but also I don't think that this is hermetic. In a sense that, yeah, that would be my response to that. And in terms of how it actually functions, so in terms of the very process, every designer of this kind of social designers or artists, because it was like a mixed group of people who deconstructed these flags, had a total freedom to do whatever they wanted, you know. So some of them are in fact, you know, they might be considered, as I just see whether we have it, you know, pretty weird, you know, like you had, like, yeah, if you took every of them like a kind of in separation, possibly they are a bit, they might be sometimes more clearly related to the topic, depending on a person who actually designed them. And in other cases of these flags, they were definitely more somehow maybe demanding to see the connection between these three arrows and the kind of message conveyed, right? Or like the kind of the visual form, so to say, and the message conveyed. But I think that it worked in a kind of cluster, you know, but people actually, when they also about this duck rabbit, you know, but when they convey, people generally speaking, convey messages depending on the context in which it is presented, you know. So then it is easy to say that, you know, like, you don't have to pull over, like, even though if you could possibly, every single of these flags. It is open to this type of interpretation as well, but it's not necessary to actually gather a message of the whole cluster as, you know, just as I explained it to you, like trying to give a positive vibe to the system, that to the icon that is undeservedly forgotten and needs to be decontaminated, you know. I hope that this responds somehow to your thing. So in fact, like artists were really, artists or designers were actually having much more freedom than when they are like designing like according to a brief of some sort of a, for example, advertisement company or something like that, uncomparable, you know. And then responding to your second question, I think there is a reason why they write this at the whitewash, right? Making art useful, maybe you haven't seen it. I'm talking about you, but it's basically I also haven't realized it at the beginning. Katrin had to point it to me. Making art useful since 1889, right? I think that this is a kind of legacy that they want to relate to. And also the Museum of Art Utile as such also has this ambition. And this atlas I presented to you also has this ambition to show that this kind of stuff is a not novel thing. I think that it originated precisely in the same moment in which the notion of artistic autonomy emerged, which is also a very problematic notion. I mean, like, you know, from the sociological perspective, autonomy of art doesn't make too much sense, you know, except as a regulatory idea that, or like a kind of socially grounded illusion, what Bourdieu calls illusio, or that, you know, like, because so many people believe in their own autonomy, they become somehow autonomous, you know. But if you think about how the field was located, or field of autonomous art was located within the larger social structure, it always was somehow compromised. You know, so I guess that these people want to show the porosity, historical porosity as well, not only this, me too. Porosity of this kind of notions that like autonomy, like instrumentalization, the kind of like, you know, that are very context dependent, and that also there were a lot of people who kind of moved in between or between this and that, and did lots of stuff, because it's also supposed rather to be liberating, I think, than to be kind of moralistic in a sense, like more liberating this kind of this idea that art can be used and that art can be applied, that people can do both, rather than say there is only one way of making art which is deemed as proper. I hope that also kind of responds to your question. But I will, okay. I will happily engage in a longer conversation with that. Anyone?
Is it on? Hello?
Do we have more?
Kuba, I just wanted to make an observation. I found myself thinking of Jeremy Deller, quite a quintessentially English public school boy from Nunhead artist, who with his banners and his playful substitution of the police for the miners and the miners for the police. And that seems to go a little bit with your idea of hope. And so I just thought perhaps as a is there any resonance in what I'm saying, or are you having to work in a very, very different environment because of the underlying fascist threats that you're talking about?
No, I should use a fascist threat as an excuse. Well, possibly every figure that you would like to, maybe other way around. I personally don't have a kind of like a grudge against Deller, in which I do not, maybe lots of people would disagree with me. We have had this actually, I haven't shown this picture, and I actually didn't want to come here with a t-shirt with this very nice kitten, and that every, which is a riff on his action about this, with this quotation from Primo Levi, that every age has its own fascism. We got it from a festival in Lublin. Maybe it's actually a good response. We got it from a festival in Lublin, where a pair of curators, just about the time in which we were doing our action, was organizing a public art festival in which they struggled for LGBT plus rights, mainly. A lot of works did. They also invited Deller. He sent them this design. These t-shirts were widely distributed. People did enjoy it. The festival did not spend a lot of time distributing it, so we could get like 7 of them or something like this. I wanted to come in this t-shirt here, but then I thought, it would provoke this kind of question. But Deller is a kind of yes, this figure that people love to hate. I think some of them, and some others love to laugh or love to buy or whatever. But then this Battle of Orgrave, I show it actually to my students, and I discuss this movie. But I show it from this position of Mike Figgis, this movie that he made about the Battle of Orgrave, which I think is super interesting, especially if you compare it to the narrative of Claire Bishop about the same action, or the narrative of Armagh, because it shows also this, like Deller is a kind of decentered authorial figure running here and there, not being really in control of events, while giving such a platform to all these people who were working on this set. Conveying real social emotions that were, and still are, I think, in this country, so extremely important, right? And what I'm getting is that maybe, you can actually use wrong actions for good reasons, just as you can instrumentalize good intentions for creepy or good ideas like freedom of speech for completely creepy pursuits of creepy fascism or something like this, I know that this is still very convoluted what I'm saying, but this is not a simple question, so I do not have a very simple answer that I could give you, and also prefer to maybe build a couple of positions that can help us to think about this situation.
Thank you.
So maybe 2 more questions, one here and one there. And maybe you first ask the questions and you answer them at the same time and try and make them short. So.
So I don't know if it's a question or more a comment. I was wondering if
Could you speak please to the microphone?
if the library space the artist capitalism, where artists or fashion designers are invited to work for mass production, and it actually goes. It would be kind of the evil twin of what you're describing. So anyway, there's not a real question, but a comment.
No, I think like yeah, exactly. Like you think, for example, Berlin Biennale organized what was 2016, right, with this post-internet stuff. It's plenty of this kind of things that look very similar in a sense. Like for example, they want to, or like this, operate on this one-to-one scale, so to say, but are employed simply for the one of the means of capitalist reproduction, or sexifying it somehow. Yeah, sure. But then it's an interesting thing then would be to think about what is actually the role of autonomy here. What is the role of critique, of criticism, and so on and so forth. And this is also actually a question about artistic institutions, about how art in general is being embedded in this systems of capitalist reproduction, both in a sense of this actually, because I think that what pretends to be autonomous art does it just as often and just as good, rather than what is just considered an applied art. And then the question would be, for what kind of purposes do you work? So it's not any longer the question of that it's autonomous or not, but how it is embedded, in what kind of situation is it embedded. So my response would be, there is not something like as an autonomous art. It is still, of course, important notion, an important type of concept, and yet we see a lot of processes in which it is transgressed on such a massive scale that it's very hard to maintain this notion as anything but a sales speech, or like also as anything but a kind of institutional way of maintaining kind of actually existing autonomy of certain institutions, which is also might be very important. But where I'm heading is that this process happen anyway. So the question is how all these practices are embedded, with whom they are aligned, what kind of context do they operate in, and that's what's a real discussion. That would be my response. More actually also quite Brechtian in a sense.
That's actually exactly what I was going to ask about, because you've shown us, it's such a great talk about it, thank you. What you've shown us is a museum context for these practices, or post-practices, and you've shown us a street context, a demonstration context, but I was wondering if there were other contexts going on in Warsaw or wider, do you have like not galleries or kind of, I don't know, autonomous spaces or I'd love to know what other kind of salient contexts that are being worked with other than maybe, where they do get into the more kind of formal range of things.
Yeah, but it was also like one of my, I need to work a bit more on this part in terms of like presentations, because obviously that's a kind of like one of the obvious things that you see a lot of flags, banners, street protests, and so on, and then you think about all these other activities. And I was thinking about it in this, maybe in a context of conveying maybe not even conveying the messages, but more of a communicating. I think there's a lot of things that happen in this way. I also see people who are like working ground up, like doing possibly like a lot of community work and so on and so forth. But what you see as the stuff that people are really passionate about, because that's what gets conveyed in a kind of global circulation of information. So for me, it's much more easy to access info about some sort of spectacular artistic event that happens in a context of demonstration. Like for example, like this iconic poster of Occupy Wall Street made by Artbusters. Everybody knows it, everybody kind of gets acquainted, while it is much less, you need to make a real effort in order to get to this kind of ground up, grassroots kind of initiatives that are many, that are hundreds, that artists do the work on a kind of everyday basis. And I think that another question which actually is really interesting to me is obviously the question of artistic studio, and this kind of experience that I think for a lot of artists is so important, and also of artistic institutions that provide some sort of like basis or space of this white cube where this kind of skills can be tested or honed, or also where you can expect certain type of sensitivity to emerge, and to be maintained. And I would be very hesitant to completely dump this notion. So whatever I said about this autonomy, still this is a socially powerful idea, that people are somehow able to actually work in a very precise way and have a full control over, or like whatever full control means, but this is very full control, bodies genetically wired and so on and so forth, and you're all going to die, etc., right? But then, so like full control is a very, very illusionary notion anyway, and yet there is this kind of like social conventions that people do have more control in some spaces, in some activities than in others, which is somehow important, I think, and then there comes a whole tradition of also like leftist thinking about artistic labor, which is not a commodified type of labor, but this would open the floodgate of Marxist theory that we want to avoid because we want to have a pint. Okay.
Thank you.